Hey everyone, welcome again to another episode of Disability Landscape. I'm your host, Charlie Brose. With me today is Terry Hansen as our co-host.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Today we are talking to Dave Dively of the Minnesota Council on Disability. Got that right. Dave, it's legislative time. What are you bringing to them this year?
Yes, thank you. So my name is David Dively with the Council on Disability now for getting close to about 3 years. And this is a really exciting session. They're moving at breakneck speed since week one, really. And we're already seeing some really fascinating, important bills and issues being brought forward.
Okay.
So, our agenda has maybe a dozen things on them, but I'll kind of hit some of the highlights and important things I think your audience might be most interested in. One of them is that one of the bills we've been working on, this is our third year on this same bill, and we think we might get it through this year, is the essentially improving how the state employs and hires and then retains employees with disabilities as an employer, as an organization itself. And it is everything from there's an affirmative action program that gives folks with disabilities a preference in terms of hiring called Connect 700. It does a lot of work in that space, but also for folks who are hired in traditional venues instead, or people who become disabled as a part of their life independent of work, right? It elevates and makes consistent across the different state agencies the role of the ADA coordinator, the competencies and minimum qualifications, and also kind of gets them out of that HR-only employee-employer accommodation situation and puts them into a position where they directly report to the commissioner of that agency or the lead of that agency, so that ideally they can be integrated into how they operate as a whole instead of just that one-on-one employer-employee basis. And so that's one of our major bills we're working on this year.
Okay.
And then there's a whole lot more. The other one that I was thinking of that folks might be especially interested in is one that we're doing in collaboration. We're certainly not the leader on all the bills. There's many wonderful nonprofits and advocates that do lots of great work. Just this week, there was a bill heard that would, for folks who use MA EPD, so they're employed persons with disabilities who still are on MA for waiver services and disability support, such as PCAs. That currently there's a fee to buy into it, a premium essentially, like a health insurance premium, and then there's also an asset limit to the amount of money you can have as assets before you kind of disqualify yourself out of that program. And this bill would remove the premiums entirely and the asset limits entirely, which would be very substantial change to the program and how it works, and also allow folks with disabilities to save up more sizable amounts of funding for vehicles, for property, buying homes, all those, and $2,000 in assets is really limiting for people. It really perpetuates kind of a poverty life in order to maintain the services that we want and need and able to live independently.
Right, because a great many disabled people are able to work, they want to work, but with limitations like that, it makes their options exceedingly slim.
Yes, absolutely. And some of them get into positions where they're paying for both their employer-based, insurance plan and MEPD's insurance, and then they kind of work together as two insurance providers at the same time, but it still costs more for folks, with disabilities. So it was very warmly received by the committee. We'll see if it continues to make the steps it needs to. There's a long way to go still, but that's a big one. And then housing. This is one that we hear about all the time, whether it's the state fair or folks emailing us or calling us, is that there's not enough accessible and affordable both housing options in the greater Minnesota areas or the Twin Cities. And so one of the proposals that's being pushed is essentially a higher requirement for if you build a multi-unit home, such as like an apartment or a condo, a certain percent would be required to be both accessible and affordable if you use state funding to help support that project. And this is being modeled after Richfield, which is a city, has that as an ordinance. And groups like the ARC and others of us are grouping together to try to make that statewide. And that would be a longer systematic kind of change over time, because obviously this would be proposals and then being built and then living there, so there wouldn't be immediate fixes
Right.
for folks. But frankly, a lot of these challenges, like the low-hanging fruit, that's things that we can get done and make a difference overnight. A lot of that stuff has already been checked off the list. We have a lot of the basic protections and anti-discrimination things, so a lot of these are now big system changes, and unfortunately those take longer to come into effect.
I think we've been waiting a long time for the hotel and motels to lower the beds so we can transfer into those. I just did a cruise and we had to have them, and they can't take the base out, it's nailed to the floor.
Okay.
So you have to start adjusting the mattress and the pads and things like that. But you're going to be there for 12 days. That's a lot of transfers in and out. So
Yep.
it would be nice if those, they could get those down.
And that makes me wonder about the jurisdiction on those, because for a lot of disability issues, cruise ships that especially travel to international waters aren't actually based in the legal sense out of America.
Right.
And that's how they also have different ADA obligations because of that.
The room itself is very accessible. They've done everything except lower
Except
the
the
bed.
beds.
Yeah. Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. The bathroom facilities were great.
Okay.
And it's a larger room. My family went with, and we could barely get into their rooms. And our room, you could get in and turn the chair around and everything
Yeah.
like that. But the bathroom's very accessible. And the one cruise we were on had power doors. You just
Yep.
put the key in and the door whips right open. So that was nice, but you can't get into bed.
Yep. No, that's important. One other one that's fascinating, that's right on the cusp, is working on electrical vehicle charging stations. So right now, there's huge money being put in from the feds down to the state, and then from the state down essentially to like vendors or grants to roll out. Because as electric vehicles, begin to build out, we need the infrastructure to support charging, so people can, come back home on the way home from a long road trip or something. And the ones right now that are funded by the government already need to be ADA compliant and building code compliant for accessibility. There's also a significant number of them that are being paid for by private funding, and you'll find them at places like a Hy-Vee parking lot or a Target parking lot or things like that.
Right.
And those right now are not typically accessible for folks with disabilities. They don't use the same code compliance that the feds require for the units that they pay for, or partially pay for. And trying to push our building code requirements as fast as possible in a way that is fair, but also really allows folks with disabilities to utilize this infrastructure that they have equal access to. We should have equal access to, just like anyone else. And there's some strong, lobbying groups that are opposing it, because there's some extra costs involved in that. But we still think it's the right thing to do, and we think ultimately it will become the law. So why not do it right now, and then you don't have to retrofit all of your
Be ahead of the
stations
curve.
in a couple of years. Yeah.
If I'm correct, this year is a policy year for the legislature. They usually do a fiscal year and a policy year.
Yep, and this is our fiscal budget year.
Oh, it's the budget year.
And then next year is our policy bonding.
Okay.
Traditionally. Yep.
Right, and with the 10, requests or bills that you're trying to sponsor, what kind of progress do you expect to see with this session?
Yeah, so we have, right now we're about to get in about, by the time this airs, it might be out already, the end of February. We'll have the February forecast, which is the official numbers from the state that says this is the exact amount of money we have that we project as a surplus, and as a balanced budget state, we're legally obligated to follow that number in terms of how much we spend or cut and things like that.
Right.
But it looks like it'll be somewhere north of $17 billion.
Wow.
A good chunk of that's one time, but also a good chunk of that is ongoing money and going into next and into future budget cycles. So
That's just for the state of Minnesota?
that's just the state of Minnesota.
Wow.
Yep. So if you think of like a $60 billion-ish budget, 17 billion is a pretty big chunk of
Yeah.
extra money. Yeah, right.
And 25% more.
Yes. So the question is what to do with a lot of that. And other than things that like the governor's proposed, some kind of like one-time rebate checks, there's some legislators proposing fully removing Social Security income from being taxed entirely as an idea. And then there's other folks who are looking at just modifying the tax rates across the board in other different ways. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of consensus yet on exactly what that looks like.
Well, with the Social Security abatement, tax abatement, that would really affect a lot of people with disability and the senior community as well.
Yes, however, for folks who live entirely on Social Security as their main or only income source, that is already, for almost everybody in Minnesota, non-taxed income.
Okay.
You have to meet a higher threshold before you'd have to start paying in. But for folks who have multiple revenue in streams, or maybe they have a retirement plus Social Security, or whatever kind of funding they live with that goes beyond Social Security, this would help them as well. Then yes,
Okay.
as well as folks who maybe have a pension and Social Security and things like that as they retire, like you mentioned, elderly folks. Yep,
Right.
absolutely.
So does that 17 billion, one of my favorite restaurants, we just went to the other day, and they've got a whole corner blocked off under construction, and what is that for? Well, they're putting in accessible bathrooms. So they just changed ownership, and the other one, I never tried it myself, but either the door was too small or the hallway to get to it was too small to get in. Do they get any help with that?
That's a great question. So privately operated and owned businesses, so the way our legislature works and our Constitution frankly works is that anything that the state does for a private business to do its own business can't be done through bonding dollars. Has to be done through general fund tax revenues, that sort of thing. There are some initiatives such as an accommodations fund that would help smaller businesses pay for accommodations for their own employees with disabilities in the private sector, like we have at the state enterprise for agencies. And there are initiatives and proposals I've seen for like the city of Minneapolis to help increase their accessibility, curb cuts, all those sorts of things. But the way that we typically pay for like infrastructure, housing, buildings, roads, streets is through bonding. And that can only be for things that the state directly delivers or is a part of the state's process. So I'm not aware of any, there might be some grant opportunities possibly. There certainly are tax incentives.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of additional funding opportunities because the ADA requires them to continuously monitor and remove barriers over time as like a living document requirement. It might be where they did a remodel of some sort, and then it triggered a bunch of new requirement codes in the building code, and now they're finding that they have to do all these other things as well.
Well, we were wondering when the business had sold, if they were going to be required to change that, and evidently they were. So they said it'd be probably a couple more weeks before it's done. So I'm anxious to see what it looks like, but I'm just wondering if they were able to get any help with that.
Yeah, for the most part, private businesses aren't getting public funding for ADA accommodations or building code remodels because what we really want to see from like a public policy perspective is that folks include the cost of doing accommodations, of changing their programming, bringing in interpreters or braille printing, embossing, whatever the things they're doing is that they're considering that as part of like budgets that they create for how what it costs them to do business. And not it to be like, here's what we do, here's our costs, but if folks with disabilities come in, then it messes everything up. Like we want it to be part of how they think of their business costs entirely.
Well, and as Terry brought up though, I mean, the business just changed hands. Is there something that in the changing of hands, they are required to bring it up to code, including bringing accessible factors into play?
Well, at any moment, you're expected to and required to be at code. Okay. So I'm not aware of business ownership changing, triggering a new code requirement. Okay. And again, there's a slight difference between what the ADA requires and what the building code requires. Sure. They're very similar but different. The building code is like triggered upon a remodel, new construction, things like that. ADA is an ongoing obligation regardless if you've changed anything. Right. So they're a little different. But I believe it's expected that businesses just accept that as part of the cost of doing business. Yeah.
So the Council on Disability, what are your other like day-to-day functions for people?
Yeah, so I like to say that we lead with policy, we lead with advocacy, but there are several other things that we do that aren't specifically about legislative work or policy recommendations to the governor's office, things that are outside of that. Right. So one of the main things we do is training. We do disability awareness, disability etiquette. and then some of them that are more comprehensive or more in-depth as well. But a lot of folks really want an introductory base level. How do I begin to think about accessibility in our organization? And this could apply to levels of government or to the private sector and nonprofit sector alike, and we do it typically at no cost. And our goal really is to get folks to see accommodations, to see inclusion of folks with disabilities as not only like the right thing to do. There's some like heart social society work level,
Right.
but also really good for business, good for when you have folks that have different perspectives and different lived experiences. It means that you can better serve customers that way too as well. So, or if you're a county and you better integrate and understand folks with disabilities experiences and lives, when you go to deliver those services as a social worker or a case manager or something, you're better at what you can do. So we think it really kind of rises up, the tides for everyone. So besides training, we also do technical assistance.
Okay.
Folks, employers, employees, renters, or building managers, all sides of the coin, call us and say, what are our rights, or potentially what is my obligation if I'm an employer or I own a building. And then if maybe I'm feeling discriminated against, what are my possible remedies? Or maybe it's this person's accusing me of discrimination, what can I do? Or so we really work on both sides. And when we do the technical assistance side, it really isn't with an advocacy hat on. It really is just explaining to you, like, here's what's required of you, here's the legal obligations, and then maybe working on possible ideas on how they can resolve their situation. Instead of from the political side, it's really more of a technical side.
You serve the entire state.
That's right.
Do you find more difficulties in rural areas in getting people compliant or letting them know they need to be compliant?
So the lived experience of folks in greater Minnesota with disabilities is absolutely different than folks in the metro. It's not even just metro mobility versus no metro mobility.
Right.
That is, of course, a part of it.
That's a big thing.
But there's also other things too, for sure. So outside of the fact that St. Paul specifically has a lot of very, very old buildings which create a lot of accessibility issues on their own, kind of putting that aside, generally speaking, it can be a little bit more difficult to get greater Minnesota cities, counties, businesses on board, but it's mostly not any kind of ill will. It's just more just not being aware of what obligations are. And so we really start by like appealing to people's better nature. Like we think you want to do the right thing. We think you're trying to learn and do the best thing. You just made a mistake or didn't know you were supposed to do whatever.
Right.
So we want to help you understand better. And for honestly, for most groups, companies, people, that does do the trick. For some folks it doesn't, but for a lot of people it does. And then of course issues like how snow impacts transportation, things like that, that's true everywhere. If we don't have a good cleared sidewalk in Minneapolis, it's just as bad as it is in Brainerd. Like that doesn't matter as much, but they're definitely different experiences. And one thing we're hearing repeatedly is that housing is particularly more challenging in greater Minnesota, accessible housing.
Right.
And so that one, that's just tough because unlike other community groups, think of different Hmong or just different racial and ethnic communities, they do have some sort of like critical geographic mass where you can I can focus on this city or this neighborhood and I can make a big impact in this community. And that's fantastic. But with communities of folks with disabilities, they're literally spread out throughout the entire state.
Right.
So if you said we're going to focus on building homes, for example, in St. Cloud and Bemidji, you might have made a great improvement for the quality of life in those two cities, and it does nothing for anyone else in the other 85 counties. So that's one of the really big challenges in not having that geographic critical mass that is having a disability, which means because we're part of every family, every county in the state, every city, and there's not a geographic spot where we all decide to live in one city together.
Right.
To that doesn't happen in the same way. So that creates a separate challenge, especially when trying to advocate for things. When they go, well, tell us where we can do the most good. Well, you'd have to help the whole state.
Right.
And that makes a challenge.
And you have thousands of small towns that, they might think they ever see a disabled person, but there are plenty out there that have hidden disabilities that need the assistance.
Absolutely, especially when you include non-apparent disabilities, ADHD, mental illness. You really are hitting every city, every county in the state.
We did a resort. Friend of mine had gone up there a lot of times, and the fishing was great. I love to fish. And he said, come on up. They've made one of the cabins accessible. Well, their idea of accessible and what was needed was different. It's a very short little ramp led up to by a dirt path, and it was too steep. You couldn't get up the ramp without a run at it. You couldn't get a run at it because you were in the dirt. And when you did get up on top of that, they hadn't allowed enough room to open the door. You had to back off the ramp to get the door open.
Okay.
So, and I said, you can't advertise this as
As
accessible, because it's not. And they said, well, you know, they needed a platform
Yep.
with a ramp leading up to a platform big enough to get the door, wide enough to get the door open on, but
That makes sense.
they tried.
One of the things we are supporting, I would say, is probably better than leading, is the Department of Natural Resources is requesting funding to continue, I guess is a way to phrase it, to retrofit, renovate, and remediate parks and trails to
Yep.
increase accessibility in the state parks. And we fully support that and embrace that and are advocating for the legislature to adopt that. One of the challenges really with parks, trails, natural locations, geography, you know, not man-built structures, is that the accessibility and the accommodations and how you design it really has to like go hand in hand with like the terrain of you know, you're not just going to
Right.
build a tunnel in the middle of a lake, you know, like it's
Right,
like, so you have limitations.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times what we find is that kind of like what you're saying is they've done kind of to the best of what they can without essentially removing or destroying the thing.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's about as far as they can go.
Yep.
And part of it is to kind of preserve the natural park and trail design that was created in nature, but that also means that they're not all as accessible
Yeah, I
as
know.
we'd like them to be.
We did a Rainy Lake fishing trip a few years ago, and they had put in a hoist
Okay.
and we went chair and all into the boat.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was really slick, and there are instructions on there, very plain, and anybody could go up there and make it work. And I thought that was really great.
Yeah, that's phenomenal to hear. I love when I go to a hotel or resort or something, you know, for a conference or something, and I see a lift, you know, in a swimming pool or something, you know, and it's just things that we're continuing to get better. We have a long way to go,
Yeah.
but the awareness, the knowledge, the implementation is continuing to increase, and a lot of it is a result of people advocating, people sometimes involving litigation sometimes is the only way to make change occasionally, and pushing the envelope, right, continuing to iterate and build on what we have.
I just did a cruise around Spain, and we visited a lot of churches and museums and stuff like that, and there was a ramp everywhere. Most of them were not to code, but they were a ramp, and we were able to get in, see what we wanted to see, and that stuff, and curb cuts everywhere, and we were in 10 different cities. I was amazed at how easy it was to get around, except for the cobblestones.
Yes, that's
They
what we
haven't
always hear.
replaced those, and
That's what we always
that's a
hear.
challenge.
that is definitely
Yeah, and I'm not sure they're going to
rough
go there.
ride,
I think
no.
they want the aesthetic, they want
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
history.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Well, and to Terry's point about the cabin, so many people assume that people with disabilities travel with someone to help them
Right.
all the time.
Yes.
And that's not the case. We want to be as independent as we possibly can in circumstances such as this.
Sure.
And so, yeah, they thought they, you know, would have done something to make this accessible, but they don't think about a accessible person or a disabled person traveling by themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. You know, whether it's the size of, well, everything, I suppose, all the clearances, all the widths and heights and everything really would be impacted on if you envision the space as a single individual or 2 or 3 folks, right? Like that would really change a lot of how you design all of that. And then also remembering that an accessible location needs to not only be accessible from a mobility perspective, you know, heights of things and widths of you know, all that, but also, you know, sensory accessibility, visual alarms for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, possibly you know, different kinds of telephones or communication equipment. You know, so there really is a very like even the acoustics and how it sounds and echoes, and because audio or visual stimulation for people with certain sensory disabilities can also be overwhelming or triggering epilepsy, all those sorts of things. So when you think of like what it means to be like an accessible unit, there really is like a gigantic list of what you could include and,
Right.
and build into this thing.
Yeah.
And eventually they kind of have to just pick what they can do or want to do or are willing to pay for.
Yeah.
Going beyond putting in a ramp and going, yep, that's it. No, that's not it, but it's a nice start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it would seem like these places that, like you're saying, the new buildings and things like that, that stuff's built in. And to do it at that time, it helps everybody. I mean, even the able-bodied people. We did one of the cruises in Alaska, and we were going to see one of the glaciers. And our accessible room had a large enough balcony that all 8 of us could sit on the balcony and watch this thing. So they came from their other little tiny rooms and into our room. So it was nice for them also.
Yeah, that's nice because, right, like one of the goals that we have with all of our advocacy is community and social integration, right? It's like you were saying, like it's about living in the community we want to live in, worshiping, playing,
Right.
being a family, and having choice and independence, but also being integrated into the communities and groups that we want to be. And so if, in order to be in an accessible room, that means you have to be alone or disconnected from your friends or family, that's only getting us part way
Yep.
of what we're trying to achieve, right?
Yep.
Which is really being as integrated into the place that we want to be in. And for everyone that looks different, but we want
Yep.
people to have that choice.
So the session wraps up in May, I believe, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
And you got 10 initiatives you're hoping to get some progress on at least.
Yeah, and things are moving quickly. So there's certain deadlines that you have to make in order to kind of keep staying live, if you
Right,
will.
right.
And a lot of bills, both by advocates and collaborating partners, as well as ourselves, are making deadlines well in advance of deadlines, which is great news at this point. We still have to see how it all ends up.
Yeah.
And given last election cycle, I'm presuming the outcome helped you guys somewhat in getting some of this stuff moving through.
I mean, sort of. I mean, honestly, we really do pride ourselves on being really, nonpartisan.
Sure.
And so it's not so much that one party is more supportive to us than others, but when we have split control, it has certain benefits to democracy and to checks and balances.
Right.
But as far as getting things just through legislatively, when you have one party in control, it's always going to, and if you can get them to believe in your issue,
Right.
it always makes it a little bit easier. And I would say the one very obvious thing is we're very unlikely to have any kind of shutdown of some sort. That they would want to deliver their budget on time and
right.
not miss those deadlines.
Right.
And that's always nice because we don't want people worrying about losing services or benefits or interruptions in their life, that sort of thing. But yeah, this has been a very productive session so far. Over a month into it, and almost everything has bipartisan sponsors, typically led by the party in charge, but additional legislators signing on to it from other parties.
authors, it'll go.
Yep.
And you have
There's
to,
nothing wrong with this plan.
yeah,
That's right. We have a very strong bipartisan support for disability issues in Minnesota, and I think that's a big blessing for us.
and you have to think that many of those legislators have contact with a disabled friend, relative, something like that. That
Yeah.
it would be good. I mean, they should be able to see that.
Yeah, and
That would be
that comes up all the time in those committee hearings. Yep, my daughter, my uncle, my
Yep.
son, my mother, or,
Yep.
I can relate to this because of X or Y or Z, and we're like, yeah, exactly. It's not people hidden away in the that you don't know about. You have your own family members or relatives or friends
Yep.
that that has a different disability maybe, but you can see why, and then unfortunately sometimes we do have to have legislators, and this is not true just of disability things and not true just of Minnesota, but sometimes we do have to have them have their own experience and connection
Right,
to it
right.
for it to
Yep.
become important to them.
Exactly.
And this is one of those issues that I think actually is really easy to do that with, though. Other times, other issues not as much.
Yeah.
Well, David, I want to thank you for being with us. Unfortunately, we are out of time.
Oh, that went too quick.
But
It did. Yep,
but
yep.
we do want to check back with you from time to time to see how things are going in the legislature, and hopefully we'll catch up again this summer, and we can, kind of have a recap.
That would sound lovely. I'd love to do that.
you
So
go.
thank you.
This is Charlie Bros with guest host Terry Hansen. We're Disability Landscape. We'll see you next time.